Morning, and thank you for the opportunity. Perhaps a starting point would be to examine the other provisions of the Constitution. For example, Section 21 allows everyone the freedom of movement. So that encompasses a very important right that you are able to travel freely and without hindrances. Now, this has led to people making a decision to wanting to travel, and hence we're seeing all over the Republic various kinds of challenges. Now, if I'm to look into the facts of the matter as they were presented by the Minister of Home Affairs, it appears that there was very little in the way of hindrance that the department couldn't be held responsible for. Here's what the minister has said. Botswana has closed down its borders with the result that the minister also alluded to the fact that there were checks and balances in place for truckers to obtain the permission before they get to the border. So there had to be truck stops before that, and paperwork had to be in order. And the minister says, because of the huge overflow from the Botswana border crossing into Musina, this has resulted in this terrible backlog that we see, which is the minister's view that the truckers have not adhered to the protocols that were in place. However, the human tragedy is very, very real. And the right to dignity encompasses a right to a safe environment. This is now part of the emerging thinking that if your environmental conditions are not optimized, then it could be said that your human rights have been trampled upon. So it's a very interesting outcome that we're seeing from this. So what are some of the human rights issues that you're seeing there? For one, water is a basic human right, and there is no water, ablution facilities, there's no food, and we have heard of some tragic incidences of people passing on, which is very, very sad and unfortunate. The other thing that the minister alluded to was the lack of law enforcement agencies or assistance. Because of the huge demand that the festive season has brought upon us, the law enforcement, the traffic enforcement was redeployed elsewhere, with the result that the border crossing stand that the situation has improved considerably in the last 12 hours. And I think the minister has alluded to the fact that he believes it'll be done today. So there is paperwork aside at the border. And then there is paperwork coming to the border. And then there is this crush from everywhere else. So it's difficult to say that, your human rights were blatantly trampled upon by the department. I wouldn't be able to say that confidently.
Right. So even if, let's say, we are being charitable to the minister, government, whoever's in charge, that nobody could have foreseen what is currently unfolding there, is it an unreasonable expectation for there to be an expectation at the very least that there will be large numbers under very different circumstances? For instance, I imagine, provision for, how we treat overflow. It almost appears to me that everyone was caught off guard, even though we had known months before this moment that the situation could in fact end up looking like it is.
I think you're right. I don't think this is the first time that something like this has happened. I think it's tradition that over the festive period, even if you don't leave the borders of the Republic, for example, during Easter, the roads heading north are very, very busy. Now, the point of the matter is how much more could they plan? 3 lanes became 4 lanes. And I don't think it's unique to South Africa. This is not defending what is indefensible. I think it's just a practical reality. If you look at Europe right now, the same scenario is playing out between France and the UK. There are literally thousands of truckers all stuck and nowhere to go. So unfortunately, the way the roads are also planned, it's very, very difficult to turn back. Now remember, this is one-way traffic. it is complicated by the fact that everyone needs a COVID certificate. Now, that certificate is only valid for 72 hours. And if you're stuck in that crowd for more than 72 hours, well, your certificate expires. Now, what happens there? Secondly, the overcrowding. I mean, there are bus loads of people. I don't know what the social distancing rules are on these buses, but I could imagine that it would be quite cramped because people wanting to go home. So that is another problem. Now, all of this is compounded by the fact that we have this new pandemic, COVID, that none of us were prepared for a year ago, that caught the world by surprise. I believe personally that the government has done everything possible to try and alleviate the situation. Civil organizations have called upon volunteers to help with food and water and whatever else we could do. Given the congestion, I don't know how we're going to be able to get it there. Is it going to be a helicopter drop? Really, one doesn't know. I think we have to be fair and say that everything possible has been done and is being done to try and alleviate the suffering of these people. And obviously, in respect of commerce, you can see this necessary for exports, from South Africa. It keeps the South African economy ticking over even during this very, very hard time. So you can see it's a very, very important and challenging situation that we have at the border.
Absolutely. The question then becomes who must bear the brunt of that? If it's a situation nobody could have controlled, does it make sense perhaps that the most vulnerable in that context have to, again, be the ones who carry the burden, so to speak? I wonder, legally speaking, is there any provision that any of the travelers can take to challenge government for any damages incurred, so to speak? Do you imagine that kind of route being one that holds water in any court of law?
It's possible, and it's possible that you'll face a class action suit by people that have been affected. And that requires seeking permission from the court first and convincing the court that you have indeed a class action suit along the lines of the miners that were adversely affected by their health because of their long service in the mining industry. So one has to make out a very, very proper case. But let's play out the scenario a little bit more. On what basis will we be able to hold that the government was liable in dealing? I mean, there has to be an element of unlawfulness as well as wrongfulness. Now, what would be, how do we set those two elements that the government had acted unlawfully would be a very, very difficult hurdle to overcome. And then the second element of wrongfulness, and that is tested along the lines of the reasonable man. What would the reasonable man have foreseen in these circumstances? What harm would he have foreseen? What steps would he have taken to alleviate that? And how did the government fail to do so? I think the government will be able to argue that they've tried to improve the corridors of travel repeatedly over the years. There's been huge infrastructure spend, and there's nothing more they could do. The other compounded problem was, even if South African Home Affairs had acted and worked 24 hours, their counterparts in Zimbabwe, I understand, closed their offices at 6 p.m. Excuse me. Again, compounding the problem. I really believe that there has to be a SADC tribunal put together to try and address all of these issues,
right,
so that there is a political as well as a practical solution to this going forward.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much for your time and your insights. We'll certainly, like most people across the continent, have to wait and see how this situation unfolds.